Hello, my name is Chris Rutkowski. I'm a science writer in Canada. I've been specializing to write about UFOs and related phenomena for a number of decades, and I've been invited to give a presentation to you all today about the phenomenon as it applies to Canada and what the Canadian influence on ufology is. Please look at the first slide. The Canadian influence is that Canada has been involved in UFOs and UFO research, especially the Canadian government in its attempt to understand the phenomenon all the way through since the 1940s in parallel to the United States. Next slide. A little bit about me, first of all. On the left, you can see me with Alan Hynek. On the right, with Stan Friedman. And yes, that's my membership card for the Center for UFO Studies from back in 1983. I was only membership number 219. I thought that was pretty cool. I got in at the ground floor, so to speak. And as I mentioned, I've been writing about UFOs for many years. I now have 10 books out on the subject. This is one of my earlier ones, specifically the Canadian UFO Report, where myself and my colleague Jeff Dittman did an overview of some of the more interesting cases since the 1940s, and we presented them so that people could have a better understanding of what the phenomenon was manifesting like up here in Canada. A little bit of a history lesson. We've been able to obtain a number of government documents that detail the Canadian government's interest in the phenomenon. Here is a minutes of a meeting to discuss flying saucers on the 22nd of April 1952 from the Defense Research Board. There were a number of scientists and dignitaries involved in this particular meeting from, of course, National Defense, but also astronomers from the Dominion Observatory and also the Department of Transport. Now, the Defense Research Board created a project very similar to Project Blue Book and Project Grudge and Sign that you may have heard of from the United States. In Canada, there was Project Magnet and then later Project Second Story. The idea was to try and get a better understanding of what people were seeing, particularly some military observers. Next slide. Here's a sample of a report from Project Second Story. This document describes that a pilot was flying an aircraft at 9,000 feet over Chatham, New Brunswick. He sighted the object that seemed to be about 3 to 5 miles ahead of him at an estimated altitude of 7,500 feet. It was approaching at approximately 150 knots and passed beneath and behind the pilot's aircraft. So imagine the pilot's flying along, sees an object ahead of him, and then it comes underneath his craft, his aircraft. He had a pretty good look at the object. It was initially a metallic object, disc-shaped. On closer view, and when it got closer, it took on a more dull metallic shade. It was thought to be 25 feet in diameter, and the pilot and co-pilot were quite definite that this was not a balloon. Next slide. Now, this case was investigated by the United States Air Force, and in the opinion of the interrogator, not the investigator, the interrogator, who was a little more demanding, that the pilot was considered very reliable. So we have a very reliable witness observing an object at fairly close range, and the United States Air Force investigated this case occurred in Canada, and we simply don't have an explanation for this particular incident. Next slide. Now, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police also investigated UFOs in Canada for some time. In fact, they continued investigating UFOs up until about 1995, but I'll get to that a little bit later. This is one particularly curious case from 1960 where a hunter had been dropped off at a lake by a pontoon plane, and he was setting up camp, and after the plane left, had heard another noise of something in the sky, and he turned around in time just to see some object with spikes rotating as it fell and spinning and hit the water, throwing up water in all directions, slowly slowing its spinning until it eventually stopped and sunk beneath the lake. This case was investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and an entity called the National Research Council of Canada, which was a scientific body in the government. And no explanation was had for this. The RCMP and other scientists came out and they probed the area in the lake where this object had come down. They found a large trench had been gouged on the lake bottom, but no object was ever found. Next slide. One of the most popular and the one best known of all the Canadian UFO cases is that happened to a fellow named Stefan Mihalik in 1967. In short, he said that he had seen a disc-shaped object with a dome on top, lights coming out of it, appear to land on a rock outcropping not too far from where he was doing his prospecting. Next slide. It was about 30 feet, either 35 feet across. It seemed to have a exhaust vent on one side and some sort of doorway. That out of the doorway he could see more lights, and thought that he could hear voices coming from inside, which made him think it was some sort of American secret craft. Next slide. And this object was drawn by him. You can see that it's again saucer shaped with the dome on top. You can see on one side there's some dots that represent some sort of grid or exhaust, and then a doorway, and then the stylized version by an artist on the right. Next slide. Well, out of that exhaust vent as this object took off was a blast of hot gas, some sort of chemical nature, that caused his clothes to be set on fire, burned him on the top chest, and then there were these series of dots that represented the burns from the jets of exhaust from the side of the craft that were on his lower abdomen. He was actually treated at a hospital and examined. We actually have the records from the hospital, and the case was investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Royal Canadian Air Force and a number of other institutions. There are more than 300 or 400 separate pieces of documentation from these official government organizations, plus some other investigators who contributed, that document that something really happened to this fellow. Next slide. This is his undershirt, which was retrieved, and you could see that the upper part has been burned away, and yet the lower part does still have these jets, these dots that represent the burning through of some sort of exhaust. Next slide. One interesting feature of this case is that when it was investigated and the site was located and soil samples taken of the burned vegetation and pine needles and so forth, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Royal Canadian Air Force discovered that the soil and material was radioactive. In fact, on this document, we're going to be transferring some of the material between departments, and they regretted they couldn't just put it in the mail because the radioactive level in the soil sample precludes shipping by mail. Radiation, flying saucer, these are some of the most incredible elements that are joined together, especially since this is on official documents. Next slide. In addition, there were some molten pieces of metal that were found in the rock over which this object was said to have landed. These pieces of metal were silver, and they were also radioactive. Now, we often hear about pieces from UFOs that have been retrieved and tested, and you hear metamaterials and terms like that thrown about all the time. Well, here's a piece of a UFO quite large that has never been considered in any of these discussions, and yet these pieces were tested at laboratories, at universities and other institutions in both the United States and Canada, and analyzed by metallurgists. We have this documentation, and we even still have a piece of this material. Next slide. This is myself at the site a few years ago. This is the rock that the witness was crouching behind as he was watching this object from some distance away. It's actually accessible. You can visit the site today. In fact, there are almost a tourist attraction in Canada where you can go on a horseback ride to get to the site, and because it's in an isolated area, it's the only way to get to the site. And in town they even sell some souvenirs. Next slide. This is a photograph taken of the site of the rock of the where the object had landed back in the day by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and above it is a sketch made by the witness to guide the investigators to the site, and it matches quite well. Next slide. This is from a trip I made a few years ago to the site. There's actually a very significant and beautiful quartz vein running the length of the entire rock. And it's one of the striking features that you can see when you visit it. Next slide. And as I mentioned, the material was analyzed, and as far as the radiation, this is from the Royal Canadian Air Force investigation. It says the report indicates a radiation value of 0.3 microcuries, and the radiation is from a radium source and a possible serious health hazard. In fact, it was such a serious health hazard at the time that the Royal Canadian Air Force considered closing the area, which was a bit of a resort town, because of a danger to the population. Next slide. Despite all this, when the United States Air Force representatives investigated the site, they were less than impressed. However, and this is what they wrote in the Condon report, Roy Craig, the Condon investigator, came out and visited with the witness and went to the site once. He wrote that if Mr. A, the witness, reported experience was physically real, it would show the existence of alien flying vehicles in our environment. Now understand, they said if this particular case could be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, it would prove that there were alien spacecraft flying over the Earth. This particular case. And yet, they were not convinced because of what they described as inconsistencies and incongruities. So they said, unfortunately, the case does not offer probative information regarding unconventional craft. In other words, it just didn't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to their satisfaction. However, next slide. In the opinion of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in their report, they said neither DND nor the RCMP investigation teams were able to provide evidence which could dispute Mr. Mihalek's story. Although the investigation has been completed, a satisfactory explanation or conclusion is still lacking. So, whereas the United States Air Force was not impressed with the case, the Canadian side, which included individuals who went out to the site many times, conducted many interviews with the witness and his family and associates, could not come to a conclusion. It was still unexplained. Next slide. Also in government files is another very curious case, oddly enough, also from that year. This was at and near a Canadian Forces base in Manitoba. And there were 8 witnesses, including most military personnel, One set of witnesses was a military person and his girlfriend driving in a car on a date, and as they drove, they saw the UFO up close. Next slide. The military person observed an ultraviolet colored light coming from directly above his car, which remained stationary for 30 to 50 seconds and moved away before the light disappeared. It was accompanied by an increase in heat in the car. Next slide. Now, that particular car, when the investigators took a look at it, they detained it in the motor pool at the Canadian Forces Base. The body repairman stated that there was light dust on top of the car that was unlike any other in his experience. There was some bubbling of paint on top, and this incident was reported to the Training Command headquarters by the base duty officer, and the Training Command headquarters investigating team was scheduled to head out immediately. This is quite interesting because there was a investigating team. Now, it didn't say investigators, it actually used the term team. And when we look, next slide, at the list of investigators that were part of it, you can see in handwriting there 3 names. Some of these names were also investigators of the Falcon Lake case with Mr. Mahalik, the one previously discussed. It's possible that this team was the early version of the X-Files, because they were at the ready and were sent out in the middle of the night to investigate this particular case at another military base. Next slide. This one is particularly curious, that in 1967, again, which was one of the big flap years in Canada, 4 rings were discovered in a farmer's field as though a round, large object had settled onto the ground. Depressions seemed heavier to one side, and the ring diameters were 34 feet to 36 feet, incidentally comparable to the objects seen at Falcon Lake. Yes, crop circles were found in Canada before England. Next slide. In fact, here's photographs from the site from 1967. You can see the rings depressed into the ground. And next slide, here's a drawing showing the fact that there were a number of rings found in this particular field. Next slide. But this is the most significant slide, in my opinion. This is a document that simply says, on-site inspection of reputed UFO landing marks at Duhamel, Alberta. This is a report from the Royal Canadian Air Force regarding these particular marks. No UFO had been seen, and yet they're called UFO landing marks. And also, remember that this was before anything had been reported with regard to crop circles in England. 1967, the crop circles started in Canada and were investigated by military researchers. Next slide. And this was so puzzling that the Canadian Minister of Defense himself ordered, as it says here, a ministerial inquiry into what had caused these particular rings. So just imagine that the head of all of Canada's military ordered that an investigation be taken into this particular case, long before crop circles were ever thought about in England. Next slide. Now, this is an aerial photograph of a different case, 1977, in Manitoba, and you can see from this aerial photograph there's a few odd marks. The one at the bottom of the photo, a little round circle between 2 swathed paths of wheat. Next slide. This is what that circle looked like up close if you were on the ground. I investigated this case myself along with my colleagues. There had not been any UFO or objects seen to create it, and it was baffling even then. And this one was also before the dawn of crop circles. We called them UFO landing marks then, even though no UFO had been seen. This is an aerial drawing of the field, again showing that there were a number of marks throughout the entire field. Next slide. Here's a case that I investigated, a large circle that was found near the city of Winnipeg, but this was just after the crop circles had been found in England, and this began the reign of the crop circles in North America. Next slide. Now, from the fields to the ocean, one of the more interesting cases in Canadian UFO history is that of Shag Harbor, which is said to be Canada's Roswell. Very briefly, a very bright object was seen moving over Nova Scotia and falling into the ocean, or appears to be falling over the ocean off the shore. Now, it was reported to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who got to the shore just in time to see a bright light source on the surface of the ocean. They commandeered fishing vessels. This was very early in the morning, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and the fishermen took the police out there, and when they arrived at the site, there was simply a large patch of glowing foam on the surface of the water, but no sign of any object. The assumption was that some aircraft had fallen into the ocean. Next slide. According to the report, the UFO descended rapidly to the water with a high whistling sound. There was a bright flash on its hitting water. Single light was seen floating on the surface, which remained for a long time. Next slide. This caused quite a fuss in the area. It made all the newspapers and TV and radio. The search continued to try and find out if there was something found underneath the water. Next slide. In fact, the Royal Canadian Air Force recommended that consideration be given for an underwater search of the area. And that's what happened. Navy skin divers were sent in to try and find whatever it was that had crashed into the ocean and sunk to the bottom. However, nothing was ever found according to official records. Yet, townspeople say that under cover of darkness, some scuba divers were seen dragging something from the shore onto trucks and being carted away that way. Unverified, but it shows that it's still quite an interesting phenomenon. In fact, this particular area, a place called Shag Harbor, has its own UFO festival, and there are tours of the harbor and a small museum. Next slide. Now, much more recently, 1990, a very large object, some would describe as a mothership, was seen in the Yukon, the other side of Canada, where a number of people living along this particular lake, there's a highway that runs along the side of the lake, said they saw a very large object with portholes or bright lights along its side moving slowly and ponderously from south to north along the lake. Next slide. And this is a map of the area where you can see it indicates 6 witnesses at Fox Lake at the south, 9 at a place called Carmax, and 7 at Pelly Crossing. All in total, 35 witnesses were interviewed, all independently. They had not spoken to one another, and all described about the same thing. Next slide. Which was a series of lights all in a row that moved across the sky. However, one witness, next slide, was directly underneath the path of this object as it passed from the lake across the roadway into the mountains. He saw it directly underneath and described it as a round object with lights rotating counterclockwise and clockwise within it. Next slide. Now, One of my projects here in Canada is that I coordinate something called the Canadian UFO Survey. I've been doing this since 1989, and to do this I coordinate with all the known Canadian researchers and sources of UFO information and collect them all together and analyze the data. This is 1 year's worth of Canadian UFO reports. We have somewhere between 700 and 1,000 separate UFO reports in a year. And they're entered, next slide, into a simple spreadsheet where we record the date and the location and the province and things like type, whether something is a nocturnal light or a daylight disk or a close encounter, how long the object was seen, its color, number of witnesses, shapes, and the strangeness and reliability which comes from the Hynek UFO scale. And we do some basic analyses, and over the years we've found that that things like time is quite an interesting variable, that most UFOs are seen between 11 o'clock and 1 or 2 in the morning, with actually a peak around 11 o'clock at night. And the shapes have varied over the years. If you want, you can look at CanadianUFOsurvey.com, where the latest analyses is available for the public, and we provide the data for anyone to look at. Next slide. And through this analysis, we've found that the number of UFO reports has generally been increasing, with a few peaks and outliers here and there. Over the past 5 years, the number of UFO reports has apparently declined, except in 2020 the number jumped, and then 2021 the number of UFO reports went down again. Next slide. In this pie chart we show the number of total reports by conclusion. Since 1989 we have around 23,000 separate UFO reports, which is actually about double what Project Blue Book looked at. The vast majority, 48%, were probable. In other words, the witnesses were watching a star-like object for a number of hours that probably was a star. Insufficient evidence was 34%, that we didn't have enough information to determine whether something may have had an explanation. 7% of the cases had explanations. We knew which aircraft was flying over at the time, for example. But 11% were left unexplained. In other words, we couldn't attribute what was seen to any particular thing very simply. Next slide. I mentioned Project Blue Book. This is a pie chart from actually the Project Grudge, which is just at the beginning of Blue Book. If you look in the upper left corner, it says unknowns 19.7%. In other words, the Canadian UFO Survey, we civilians were able to explain more UFO reports than the United States government. Is that good or bad? I don't know. Next slide. I've mentioned several times that we have documents related to UFOs in Canada. This is an actual UFO report from the Canadian Air Force, specifically the base which is NORAD, the North American Defense Command, which Canada is partnered with the United States. This is actually the UFO report. It actually says UFO in the subject line, and it was sent to me a number of years ago because I was cooperating and coordinating UFO reports. Next slide. This is another version of the official government UFO reports. This is from 2009. It actually says UFO reports. They had a form to fill out. Can you imagine a form to fill out by military personnel if they had seen a UFO? Very similar, I think, to what the United States Navy and Air Force are preparing now, only 15 years later, regarding UAPs. But this was back in 2009. The reporting person was an air traffic controller. So the person who is directing aircraft at a military base saw a UFO and reported it as a UFO with this UFO form, and the information was passed along. Next slide. Now, pilots do report UFOs. In fact, Transport Canada, which is the governing body which regulates issues in air travel in Canada, does require pilots to report UFOs based on its planning and procedures manual. This is a version of the manual from 1999. It's online now and is actually still active, and it has this particular directive, next slide, where pilots are told to make reports called service reports, which are communication instructions regarding vital intelligence sightings. And what's a vital intelligence sighting? Well, the examples are below. The first one listed is unidentified flying objects. Pilots are required to report unidentified flying objects, not UAPs. Canada still uses UFO rather than UAPs, but pilots are required to report this, not just military pilots, but civilian pilots as well. Next slide. Now, where do these reports go? Well, up until 1995, this is where Canadian UFO reports went when they reported through a governmental agency. This was a very small nondescript office in Ottawa at the Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics. Now, that tall filing cabinet at the back had 4 drawers. All were empty except the top drawer. The top drawer consisted of what was described as non-meteoric sightings. And these were objects that were seen that could not be considered meteors or anything conventional. They were filed there. At the end of each year were transferred to the National Archives of Canada, where they were then available to any Canadian citizen to look at. And I traveled to Ottawa many times and looked at the cases myself and preparing my documentation and used it for research. Next slide. Now, one other popular theme in ufology these days is regarding crashes of UFOs and retrieval of materials thought to have come from UFOs. What would happen if a UFO craft of some sort was to crash land? How would the government go about investigating and retrieving this material? Well, we have an example of exactly this. Cosmos 954 crashed into the Northwest Territories of Canada in the 1980s, and it was investigated by the Atomic Energy Control Board and the Canadian Air Force, Canadian Forces, and the United States as well. Pieces as large as a refrigerator were discovered and retrieved, and pieces as small as the head of a pin. The inset shows an American penny, and a little tiny arrow points to a small, almost unseen piece. Now, how did they know that piece was there? Well, this Russian satellite was nuclear powered, actually had a nuclear reactor on board, and the pieces were radioactive upon discovery. There was actually some concern about danger to the people living in the area, not to mention the environment and so forth. Pieces were taken and retrieved and analyzed at a nuclear site in Canada, and the responsibility for investigation was shared by the Canadian government and the American government. They actually sent a bill to the Russians, which the Russians never paid. Next slide. I want to show you a series of more UFO reports in the government UFO files. This is one you can see. UFO procedures gather the following for UFO. This was typed out. This comes from 2004, where a number of aircraft reported a bright light falling from the sky, and one of the aircraft was the Prime Minister's own aircraft. Now, just imagine that the head of state in Brazil or the president of the United States or anywhere else flying in an aircraft, the pilot sees a UFO and reports it officially. I'm guessing that that would make headlines, that the prime minister or president's plane had encountered a UFO. That would be big news. In Canada, not so much. I reported this as I discovered the document, and nobody seemed to care. I can't imagine why. Next slide. Here's another UFO report from the Royal Canadian Air Force. This was in Quebec, and quite simply, an object was seen, and it was reported duly. This is from 2009. Next slide. This is through Transport Canada. Quite curious, 2002, a woman in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, was walking along, walking her dog, and saw an object shaped like an egg in the sky. Came towards her, dropped down, moved very, very slowly towards her. The underbelly was a dark gray color with, as she described, 4 square garters. The belly was patterned with very light illumination, and when the UFO was directly over her, it was making a low rumbling sound. And this case was left unexplained. This was 2002 in Ottawa, the nation's capital. Next slide. This is much more recent, 2019, a Surveys report from 2019 where a large bright orb the size of a football field, that's a large orb. The object hovered for a short time, then moved east very, very quickly. It notes in this report it has been assessed as not a threat, so this is for your records. They provided this information for me because it was not a threat to anyone. This comes from NORAD, Aerospace and Control, the Canadian Air Force. Next slide. This also comes through Transport Canada, something called NAV Canada. You can see the occurrence event information clearly states weather balloon meteor rocket survey/UFO. Again, not UAP, but UFO. This was also in 2019 where a pilot flying a Cessna small aircraft reported seeing an unknown object at 3,000 feet. Reported duly, as pilots are supposed to do in Canada, and the information was passed along. Next slide. One more, 2002, also over Quebec. 3 UFOs in a triangular formation. The triangles are back. The shapes, according to the Canadian UFO Survey, the classic Hollywood-style flying saucer, the one seen at Falcon Lake, largely absent from UFO reports these days. Triangles were popular in the 80s and 90s, and they've shifted to the more orbs or tic-tacs as most commonly seen. In this case, the triangle was seen for 5 minutes. Next slide. I record and describe many of these cases from the government files in my most recent book, which literally has only been published a month ago, Canada's UFOs Declassified, where I not only describe some of the more interesting cases in the government files, but I also include reproductions of the government documents themselves. This is not speculation. These are not just storytelling. These are cases that are supported by the official government's investigations. Next slide. And finally, I should note that one of the features in Canada that is relevant to ufology is that we have a dedicated UFO landing pad. This structure was created in 1967 with government money, and there are actually ceremonies held there. They've held small UFO conferences there. There's a kind of a saucer-shaped building structure to its left, you can see in this photo, which houses the Center for UFO Studies, formerly traveling display, now mounted permanently in a museum. And dignitaries have visited this. Mother Teresa herself visited this particular area when she was touring the area. And unfortunately, it's never been put to use. To date, no UFO has ever taken advantage of this beautiful landing spot in Canada, and yet it exists. Thank you for allowing me to give you a presentation today. If you have any questions, please refer them to the organizers, or you can catch me on Facebook or other social media. Thank you again.